We'll be starting up in about 2 minutes. If you have not gotten the handout for today's webinar, it is available at the website that's on the screen, and in a couple of minutes we'll throw that into the chat pod, and you can get a direct link that way too, so you don't have to try to type such a long address. And for those who are wondering, we are recording this webinar. We will post it later on along with the handout. And we'll be starting up in about 1 minute. Those of us who are joining us on Facebook Live, thank you, welcome. But remember, if you want credit for attending, especially PDH credit, you need to be on the webinar via Zoom. Thank you. And again, if you open the chat pod up, you can get a link to the handout for today, so you don't have to try typing the whole address in. So good morning, and welcome to the last of our winter season for our Topical Tuesday webinars. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York State LTAP Center of the Cornell Local Roads Program. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our session. It's on construction contract administration for local federal aid. That was the starting title, but as we developed it, we started realizing we needed to cover a little bit more. So that's why the website says construction management. And I think you'll understand as we go through why that is what we did. Now, if you have not been on one of our webinars before, or you've not been on Zoom specifically, you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see audio settings to make sure you can hear. The chat pod has been disabled, but just realize that doesn't mean that it isn't useful. You may want to open it up. That's where we're going to put messages to you. That's where you can get a link, for instance, to today's handout as an example. I may ask you to raise your hands now and then using the raise hand feature, which is near the bottom, just to answer a simple question. So as a practice, everybody just raise your hand real quick. Okay, cool. A lot of people have got that. That's all I'm looking for, a quick answer to a quick question. So that's pretty simple. Okay. And then we'll go from there. And then the Q&A is where we're going to get your questions. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A sessions box. Amanda Link and Adam Howell will be monitoring that to make sure I don't miss something, and we'll get it answered for you, even if we don't answer it today. Now, in addition, those of you who are looking for professional development hours, this is worth 1 PDH. What will happen at the end of this, you'll get a certificate of attendance, and if you've been to at least 90% of the webinar, we'll get you a PDH as well. If you need one, just let us know. Now, today we're going to be using, rather than polls built into Zoom, we're going to be using a tool called Poll Everywhere. Okay. Now, Poll Everywhere looks like this, and I'm going to clear my responses just till we get started again. And you go to our website, pollev.com/DavidOrPE, or you could have downloaded the app on your phone. You can do it on your phone and do it that way. Okay. But we're going to be using that during the course of this webinar, and actually you'll see in a second workshop that we're going to be doing later in the month of March. So I just want to get a sense of how many of you are from different agencies. So it looks like we got about a 50-50 split between state government and local, up, getting a bit of a change. We'll give you a couple of minutes. This is really, in some respects, is a practice to make sure you understand how Poll EV works. Some of them will be multiple choice like this, and some of them will actually be, uh, you'll type an answer in. I actually think in that case it's easier to use the website, but you can do it via the phone if you prefer. And you can't text every answer, so please either download the app or go to the website. Okay, so that helps me out. I'm glad to see that everybody here is working for someone today and that nobody's thinking about the weekend already. It's only Tuesday, but that's okay. We'll have a little bit of fun, hopefully. So yes, we can put the website address into the chat pod. Let me just type that in real quick. Okay, should be there if you need the website link. Okay, now this webinar is a 1-hour sort of overview of the construction management process involved with federal aid, but we're going to follow that up with a series of 3 days of detailed examination of the construction contract administration process, which is a subset of the larger process. This all comes from the Local Projects Manual. And that'll be on 3 Tuesdays starting in late March, 3 hours a day in the morning. And if you attend all 3 days, you'll get 9 PDHs if that matters to you. Day 1 is essentially a review of what we're doing today, plus some extra detail, the intro and starting of projects. Then we're going to talk about contract administration and some of the documentation and some of the special programs that you have to be aware of with federal aid. And then we'll finish the last day with construction monitoring and closeout. But at that time, we're also going to have people from Federal Highway and the State Department of Transportation who will be available to answer any questions that you've got. So we'll spend quite a bit of time doing that. And then finally, lastly, we'll end it with a bit of an exercise, hopefully a fun little game and all that. Okay.
David, the Poll Anywhere link is in the panelists.
Okay. I'll move it over to everybody. I got it. And of course, I can't copy it. I never have understood that, but it's okay. Up, Amanda beat me to the punch. She's good. That's why we have such good staff here. Okay, so what I want to do now is talk a little bit about what this all came from. As we were developing this with Federal Highway and the State Department of Transportation, we got data for local projects. And so we looked at that data. And I'll go into more detail in the actual workshop. Just to give you a sense of this, for a 4-year period of 2016 to 2019, taking out New York City, which is its own animal, there were 654 local projects where there was federal aid, which was done by 247 local agencies. Okay, now we'll come back to that in just a second. I want to definitely get back to that. But I want you to answer the question. We're going to go back to a poll question for me for a second. How many federal aid projects have you completed? And again, in this case, you could text it, but you can also do it on the website. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 9, or 10 or more. Okay, so I want to just get a sense. This actually will help me too in terms of the data that we're looking at. And as these data are being put in by everybody, I want you to realize that 151 of the agencies involved, that's almost 2/3 of the agencies that got federal aid in those 4-year period, only did one project. So that's all, just over 20% of the projects. The 2080 rule comes into play there. Meanwhile, 5+ projects was done by 44 agencies, and they did. That's only 18% of the agencies involved, but they did over half the projects. So just realize a lot of the issues may be for some people is how many projects you're doing. And we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. Um, just kind of interesting as we're looking at the data, who is the issue? Who has the issues that we have to deal with? Now, next one we're going to do another poll. As you can see, a lot of you have done, uh, 35% of you, in fact, have done 10 or more. That's good. Maybe I'll have you unmic yourself. You can help me out here when we get into a stumbling question. Or maybe you're with Federal Highway or State DOT. I know that some of y'all are on here today. But quite a few of you are new, have only done 1 or 2 projects, and hopefully we can help you out there. Okay? But what I want you to help me with next is what type of projects have you done with federal aid? Okay? So, just 1 or 2 words. Don't give me long titles. Bridge, pavement, safety, roundabout. Put in a word or two. And let's see, highway, bridge, okay? Sidewalks, trails. Yeah, let's just see what kind of projects people have done. And I'm guessing, based upon the data we got from the local projects bureau, the programs bureau, that bridges are going to dominate. And sure enough, bridge and bridges is already up on the sheet. That's about half. Okay, and I see somebody in the Q&A who isn't on poll over. You can put them in there too, is bridge, highway, and rail. Okay. There's some PSAP projects in there, some TAP, the specific federal dollar type projects, that's fine. So all kinds of different things people have done with this. And that's good. But to realize there are some commonalities, whether you're doing a bridge or a highway. And so what we're going to do is both for the webinar today and into the workshop that we're going to be doing later this month and into early April, I'm going to have 2 sort of hypothetical projects. They're they're not real in terms of actual projects. They're amalgams from data that we've collected from both local agencies and from folks with the State Department of Transportation that we're going to use as sort of a guide as we're going through some of these issues. Okay. Now, one of the projects, I may talk about a bridge, and that could be a bridge rehab. It could be a replacement. It could be as simple as pointing stone, a new deck, adding sidewalks, updating the foundation for scour. You can probably think of lots of bridge projects that you've done. And as I say, that's about half the projects that we got out of the list from the state. The other project that we might talk about, sort of keeping back of your mind, a very common one, are safety projects. And that could be safety projects in a neighborhood, adding sidewalks, ADA issues, raising the sidewalk, a mini roundabout, and realize that you can actually, in a lot of cases, use federal dollars on a larger project to enhance a particular project, both in the world of safety and even sometimes in a bridge area. Safety is actually a very common place where this is done. Okay. But we realized as we were developing this, if we focus completely on the construction process, we might miss a lot of things that would save people a lot of grief as they go through a project. So what I'm going to do is pull back and start over. And on the web, you can actually find, this is actually part of the handout. And again, if you haven't downloaded the handout, it's available on our home web page, which I give at the end. You can also open up the chat pod and you can download it there. What gave you this? If you read the details, it's very important to do so. But I'm going to read your mind right now. Everybody on the webinar is probably thinking the same thing. They're all going, the font is too small, I can't read it. And I'm going to tell you, don't try to read it. The figure is on the web or it's in your handout. If you really want the details, go through it. It reminds me actually of the old game of life where you go through each step. And it's a useful thing to look at. But what I want to do is summarize this and go through it a little bit in detail with you. And if you think about it, it really has in it the 5 major project steps that we all need to be thinking about. Okay. It has planning. What projects are you going to do? It has scope. It has design issues. It has construction issues. And then finally, it has operations and maintenance. And what it's trying to do is on one piece of paper, summarize the entire process. Very difficult to do. So let's break it down a little bit and talk about these 5 steps. And you can actually think of this chart this way. It's really big areas. Within each one, there's details. Okay. Now, what I want to do is go through these other steps and just talk a little bit about with you in, of course, just a few minutes here. So we're going to start with planning, okay? And again, you could be talking about your bridge, you could be talking about a safety project, but this is where you get a project onto your replacement plan. If there's not federal dollars, it's your own local plan. If there are, you're going to need to be part of the statewide transportation improvement program, or the STIP. You'll notice in your handout, if you look at your handout, there's a whole page of acronyms that are not filled out. That's done on purpose. I want you to start learning this logo, this lingo of abbreviations. And as you do that, you'll actually find you start understanding the process quite a bit better. This is where MPOs or metropolitan planning organizations are involved. This is where you develop your long range plans. And yes, you're probably going to need to have some public meetings to talk about this. It's a requirement for certain processes and certainly for MPOs. And even if it's not required for your own local plans, it can actually be a very good idea. Okay. So let's go with a couple of questions for you. First off, on your own, not looking at the federal process, I want you to think about your own projects. How long do you think you take to take a project from inception to construction? And think again about a bridge project or a major safety improvement, not putting up a sign. Something that's in the lines of those two projects we talked about. Okay. So most of you are in the 3 to 4 year range. Okay. Very few of us are less than a year, and that's why the planning process is so important. Even a small project is going to take a couple of years. We need to be thinking about what we're doing in 2022, 23, and 24. I don't know if you've been following all the things that are going on with the Olympics. Today is supposed to be the opening ceremony of the Winter Games next year in Beijing, but they're actually looking at a dozen years from now for Summer Games. You have to look way into the future. And I can tell you right now, if there's federal dollars involved, you probably need to add a few years to this because you got to first get it onto that state transportation plan with some exceptions. As we all know, there are some exceptions, such as Bridge New York and some other projects where we move things faster. But even those, you need to be thinking further out than most people think. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about scope now. You've got your project, you've got it on the plan, you've gone through the process of getting some funding. Now you got to develop a scope. Now, this could be, again, your bridge rehab or your safety improvement. There's two things that I want to make sure we don't forget about. First off is scope creep. This is why the last little part of the block that the state put together, they talk about finalizing the scope, fixing it. And that's really important because it's real easy to get scope creep where the project just grows and grows and grows. You want to lock it down at some point. Yes, you have to make changes sometimes on the fly when you learn new information, but be careful about scope creep because a small project can become really big really quick. Now, do you need to look at a corridor study for a safety project or a longer term issue? Do you need to bring a consultant in just to look at the scoping issue? Really big projects, you'll do that. And a lot of times, the consultant will have to be different depending on which federal process you're using. So be careful about hiring one consultant to do the scope. They may not be eligible to work on the main design. So that's something you have to be aware of. Again, you're probably going to need to have some public meetings, and you may need to loop back to planning. You may realize after you're doing the scope that I don't have enough funds. And if you do, go back. One thing we learned real quickly when we were talking with agencies who've done federal projects is if you don't have enough money, don't just keep going forward. It's better to pull back and go get the funding you need than to try to do it on a shoestring. That could be very dangerous. Okay. This is actually the time where you'll actually obtain your design consultant too during the scoping process. So one of the last things you'll do is get the design consultant on board, whether it's an in-house uh, engineer or whether you're hiring a consultant. Could be one you have in a retainer, but again, be careful of the process. So what I want to do is I want to just do a scope exercise, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Would you rather do a bridge or a safety project? So I'm going to ask you if you'd rather do a bridge, raise your hand now. Let's see how many people we get. Okay. So about 30 of you. So watch this magic. My hands are up, but all the hands are going to get lowered. Watch this. Now, how many of you would rather do a safety scope exercise? It's going to be close. Okay, it looks like today it's going to be a bridge project. Okay. By the way, if you come to the workshop, we'll definitely do the safety project for the next one. Okay. So let's look and see what's going on here, what the next thing is. Okay. So what I want to do with the scope exercise is I want you to think about for this bridge issue that we're dealing with. I want you to think about what are the parts of the project. Okay, so what do you do on a bridge project? Say you're doing a rehab of an existing bridge or even a replacement. Just list some of the things you do on a bridge project. It could be replace the deck, it could be a new joint. There's all kind of things you could think about. What are you going to be doing on your bridge? Just type in some words. You could be painting. Absolutely. Yep, that might be part of you. You could be sealing the concrete. You could be sealing the surface. You could just be doing cleaning, replacing the seals, putting in new bearings, replacement of the superstructure, fixing a flag, joints, parapets, bearings. You could be including complete streets within the overall project. You could be doing a safety feature or adding sidewalks. You could do doing other appurtenances. Could be a hydraulics issue. Yeah. Think about all the things you could be doing and how quickly that scope can get out of control. And so keep that in mind. Want to be real careful because the scope can go crazy. And so this is why a scope exercise is really useful. In some respects, I like this idea. You could even do this with the world of Zoom and the virtual world. Let people put in their ideas and then go back and figure out, okay, what makes sense. And you may want to do that long before you even get it on the stip and the tip because got to figure out if you have enough money. Okay. Okay, so we're going to skip past, as I say, just based on the interest of time, we're going to go past the safety exercise and we're going to go now talk about design a little bit. Okay, and as I say, if you come back for the workshop, we'll definitely do a safety scoping. In fact, we'll actually do a much more detailed version of this exercise. Now, when it comes to design, this is where you do a lot of your reviews, especially environmental reviews. So this is where you're going to be doing your state environmental quality review, or SEQR, as it's sometimes called, SEQR. This is where you're going to be doing a NEPA, or a National Environmental Policy Act review. This is where you obtain your right-of-way. Okay, we'll come back to right-of-way in just a second. And at the end of this process, just before we finish, is where you produce what everybody calls PS&E. Just for the sake of without me looking here, I've got it written down. But what does PS&E actually stand for? See if somebody in the Q&A can tell me what PS&E stands for. Let's just see what people type in. Plan, specification, and estimates. Okay, good. Y'all are good. Yeah. If you're not sure, you can always look it up. One of the things that I made sure we did is in the handout, there's a link to the Local Projects Manual and specifically Chapter 15. And in that particular chapter is a lot of very good information, including a lot of these abbreviations to deal with. Now, during the design process, you're probably going to be doing another meeting. Okay. Again, it may be required depending on the scale and the size of the project. And this is also where you need to obtain your permits during the design process. So as soon as you've got a good scope and you can go ahead and get your permits, go ahead and do so because that takes time as well. Now, I said we'd come back to right-of-way. Right-of-way is a really interesting problem, especially on town and village owned highways, but even on a lot of county roads where you think the right-of-way is well known, may not be. And that's because we have to deal with roads by use or streets by prescription. Okay. You essentially need a deed to know what the right-of-way is, or it's got to have been used by the public for 10 or more years. That's not really a definition that makes folks with the Federal Highway Administration super happy, as you probably can understand. I can't really blame them even. So you probably need to do a better job of getting a piece of paper, a survey that can show a deed that you could then hold up in court, get an agreement from the people who live along the roadway. And if you're wondering, it's Highway Law 189 and Village Law 6-626. More importantly, you need to make sure you got a piece of paper to understand this. Um, the link to the handout, yeah, that link is in the chat pod, but we can relaunch that into. So if you came in late, you can get a copy of the link to the handout. It's also on our homepage if you wonder. Now, we'll go into more detail about right-of-way when we do the workshop and give some real-world examples. And there's some pretty interesting issues that come up to play in right-of-way. But make sure you've got the right-of-way you need. It can stop a project faster than almost anything. Now, there are definitely lots of public meetings involved, especially with the federal aid process. But I want you to think about this. Is this a public information meeting where you're just providing information, or are you doing information gathering? A lot of times you need to have a formal meeting, and in those cases, you're probably going to have them in some fixed setting or these days virtually. The virtual concept is actually not only becoming more popular because of COVID, but actually is becoming more popular because it's easier to get people involved. So think about that and think about alternatives. How can you get ideas from the community? I'm actually a big fan, especially if it's not a formal meeting, and back all the way in the scoping or even back in the planning phase, but sometimes the design phase, rather than meeting at government offices, meet at the local fire hall or outside even. And maybe today you could do that with COVID, where you can get ideas from the people who are going to be most affected right on site. Keep it informal, maybe a charrette or some other kind of informal process where you can get ideas. And if you can do that early enough, when you're still doing either final scoping or even the design phase when you're trying to decide between a couple of minor choices, it can be very helpful in getting buy-in from the public. So keep that in mind for your public meeting process. Now, we're going to spend a lot more time on construction, sort of the last 20 minutes or so of today's webinar. I'm going to have the 3 days really focused on that. But I just want you to think about the construction process. This is where you're doing the contract letting and award. This is where you actually build or do whatever you're doing. And of course, you close everything out. Now, we're going to go back to our poll everywhere. I want you to type in here for projects you have done. They don't have to be federal projects, but any projects you've done. Typical problems that you've run into, encountered during the construction process from the day you started to let the project until you closed it out. Put in some typical common construction problems you've come up with. Utilities, yeah, extra work that's asked for, changing the scope, by the way. A problem with the contractor, a difference of understanding between what the design was and what can be built. Water problems underneath, unforeseen right-of-way issues. Rock that you wouldn't expect, that you should have probably caught with a preliminary inspection ahead of time. Flooding. Yeah, you can just make a list of the most common problems. And I want you to notice what's dominating here in most of your answers. Utilities, unknown conditions, issues with quantities that you've got to pay for, okay? And you can imagine all the kinds of construction problems that can come up. This is why it's so critical during the construction process to have a good scope, a good QA QC process, okay? This is make sure you've got good material certifications and you've done a good job with your inspection. But this also leads back to the idea you really need to understand the scope before you get started. And some preliminary investigations are really helpful, good ones, that you see what's underground. Better to spend a little money up front than to find out during construction you've got a problem. And yes, those are reimbursable, okay? But you've got to include it in your budget, okay? So yeah, all kind of fun stuff. What I find interesting, we made a list with some folks with the State Department of Transportation on what they figured their concerns were. And one of the things on the list is not on here at all. And yet I know causes a lot of grief. And that's the Americans with Disability Act, or ADA. Uh, Something you may want to think about. We are doing a webinar on that in May, but ADA issues can get you into a lot of trouble. Okay. And those little bumps that you see at the edge of the ramps and curbs sometimes, those are not designed to hold water. They seem to that way. They're really designed for other reasons. So, ADA issues can get us into trouble. So something to think about. Now, this is not really on that big chart. If we look at that big chart, it's not really on there. Oh, before I forget, somebody mentioned historic preservation. Yeah, that's a pretty. And somebody mentioned women as a problem. Uh, it's understanding women and disability issues in terms of hiring of contractors because there's usually a goal. That's what I'm suspecting that was. Uh, but operations and maintenance is really just sort of listed at the end of this process. But in my mind, operations and maintenance needs to be part of the entire process because after you've built something, after you've put it into place, you've got to maintain it. And if you build something that's very difficult to maintain or doesn't really fix the problem, you're right back at the planning process way too early. So you may want to include in your planning, your scoping, your design, and even construction, how are you going to maintain it? What is the lifespan? What are the maintenance needs? Okay. Now we talked about problems during construction. What I want now is I've finished my project. What are the biggest issues you've had to deal with after the project is done? It's been completely built, whether it's a bridge or it's a safety issue. Put in some examples of places where, good grief, what am I dealing with this now? And let's see what your biggest issues with brand new projects. Closeout documents. Okay. Warranty issues. Okay. Just realize there's no warranties on federal aid. It's low bid. Okay. Just realize. Buy America requirements. The Buy America and EBO, those are during the construction. I'm talking it's done completely. I've got the federal money. I've been paid back. I've got my punch list done. I'm talking something 6 months to a year from now. Yeah, the quality of the work. Was the sidewalk overwatered? And you don't find out that it was overwatered until the first winter comes along. Um, Nobody put any money in to maintain the structure. An underground utility failed because we vibrated the layer of asphalt on the top and the lines broke. Didn't see it for 6 months. Okay. The work wasn't done to standard, but you can't go back to the contractor to get it fixed. Okay. A fire review, and we'll come back to what fire stands for here in a little bit. Okay. The property owners, drainage, did they take care of the drainage later on? Cracking of the pavement and the concrete. You want it to last for 10 years and it lasted for 2 or 3. Finding the funds to pay for the maintenance. If you build it, how do you maintain it? And of course, people complaining, hey, I hate that roundabout, even though they're using it on a regular basis and you haven't had a crash in 6 months. I want you to think about operations and maintenance not after the project is done. I want you to put back on your hat. We've got a whole bunch of ideas, but I'm going to move on. I want you to think about the fact that operations and maintenance is part of the process and it's a big loop. And truth be told, we'll see if my pen is in a happy mood today. You going to be in a happy mood today? Yeah. It's not as thick as I'd like, but it'll do. Every one of these processes, you might need to go back to planning, okay? Or you might need to go back to scoping. In fact, if you look at it carefully, the chart shows that. But realize, all interconnected. If you were, for instance, able to put in better drainage up front and so the road lasted longer, well, heck, that paid for itself probably. It, even better, it comes out of somebody else's funds possibly. That'd even be better than that. So what I want to do is I want to do a project exercise, okay? What I want to do is I want to go through the project exercise of planning, scoping, design, constructions, and operations and maintenance. Now we're going to do this with something that is familiar to everybody. We're not going to do something related to highways at all because it's something we all do probably every single day. Okay? We don't realize we're doing this entire process. And so what we're going to do for the exercise is we're going to build an ice cream sundae, okay? So I want you to think about the process involved for building an ice cream sundae, okay? So just for the sake of argument, for just a minute here, okay? I want you to think about your project exercise for an ice cream sundae, the planning process, the scoping, the design, the construction, and the operations and maintenance. Okay, so in the Q&A, I want you to put in what you'd like to have on your ice cream sundae. So let's see what you guys put on there. In fact, actually, I'll tell you what, I can do this. Let's try this trick. I'm going to go back to my biggest issues, and I'm going to clear the biggest issues. Okay, so I want you to put, rather than calling that biggest issues, ignore the biggest issues. Okay, no, I can't write right on here for some reason. Oh well. I want you to think what's on your sundae. Okay, so what is on your sundae? You're going to have peanuts. You're going to have sprinkles. Cool. Someone's going to put a cherry. Okay, good. That's good. We got cherries, chocolate whipped cream, hot fudge, peanut butter. By the way, I hate to ask this question, but where's the ice cream? Think about it. If you're building an ice cream sundae, don't you have to have ice cream? One of the things when we're developing the project, I always like to think about the entire thing. And there's some great stuff in here. You're making me hungry. But the point is, you got to think about the process. That's the what you want at the end. That's the ending point. Now you got to figure out somebody put in the Q&A. You need to have a dish and a spoon. You got to have a good foundation. Where are you going to put it? Do you have everything you need? Did you need to go get from the grocery store? That's the planning and scoping process. Okay. Everybody wants to construct the ice cream sundae, but you got to go through the whole process. You got to figure out what the order is to put it together. You got to make sure you've got the dish and how you're going to eat it. You've got to make sure you've bought everything that's not out of date. You know, there's nothing worse than going to make a chocolate milkshake and opening the milk up and going, oh, the milk's gone bad. Or the ice cream, I haven't had it in a while and it's got that, it's just not going to taste good in a sundae. Okay. So, yeah, great ideas of what you're going to build this sundae, but it's really that whole process. And then, of course, after you're done, you need to clean the bowl, you need to put it back in the cupboard, and get ready to do this process again. So, it really is a matter of thinking about the whole process. Okay. Ooh, I like Rocky Road. That's a good one. I don't have any Rocky Road in the fridge right now. I've got chocolate peanut butter. Okay. So we're going to do this as a much longer exercise when we do the actual webinar later on, but I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward, that it's a really important process to think about the whole project. And that's actually even before you apply for your grant. It's a really good time to think about it and do the whole thing. Okay. Will it change? Yes. But the more you can think about it ahead of time, the better off we're all going to be. And once you start the process, the single most important activity, the single most important thing you need to be aware of. What do you think that is? What one word would you put it as most important? Put it in the Q&A. Let's see if anybody what's the single most important thing to think about? Cost? Budget? I'm going to tell you right now, people think I'm crazy. I don't think budget's the most critical thing. But we don't have enough money. I'm going to not argue against that. Money is an issue. But the single most important thing, the thing people always seem to have the biggest issue with, is communication. You got to communicate. The more you communicate, the better off you're going to be. Because if you don't have funds, you can't overcome that very easily. But you might be able to help solve some problems by communication. And if you don't communicate, that's usually where the more expensive things come into play. Okay? So it's communication, communication, and communication. It really matters when you think about it. Now, chapter 15 has a whole bunch of sections. We're going to go through them in a lot more detail. You can get the reference and go through it. It's a pretty bland looking document on the start, but it's got a whole bunch of sections in it. Okay. And you can go down and read through this, and we'll do that in more detail when we do the actual workshop. But one of the things I want you to realize, if you just were to download Chapter 15, you're really missing a lot. In my mind, the appendices, the forms, the data that comes with it may be even more important than the chapter itself. Now, as we get into this, I want you to be very wary. The I found this on the web in the I can share this freely section, creative captioning and stuff like that. So this is the danger acronym minefield. You'll see there's a whole list. I did not list every single acronym I could have, and we use a lot of acronyms. But start thinking about what they stand for, and if you're not sure, go look them up. That's the great thing about having the resource. You can always go look the resource up. Now, in terms of roles and responsibilities in a project, everybody has their own roles. FHWA, specifically the division, which is really just a fancy way of saying the FHWA office stationed here in New York State is the New York division. If you're in Massachusetts, it would be the Massachusetts division and so on. But the division's primary responsibilities include technical assistance, helping out with technical issues, pavement safety, asset management, planning. They work with the state, in this case NYSDOT, on the local projects issues. They conduct reviews through their stewardship and oversight responsibilities that they've got. Okay. But this is mostly at the division level unless they need to bring in a specialist. Okay. One of the primary people involved in local projects is something called the area engineer. They're the primary project contact. They're focused on risk issues. Uh, they're mostly procedure based. Okay. Make sure they're in the loop to maintain awareness of the project status. They're not getting into technical or computational aspects, but they're there as review. But they can help you with technical questions or help you find the resource for that. Okay. So keep that in mind. The stewardship and oversight of FHWA involves a whole bunch of activities. Again, we don't have a lot of time to go through, but just realize they're involved with assessment programs, something called CAP, which is compliance with certain issues. Okay. They do something called FIRE, which we had somebody mention before. This is financial integrity review and evaluation, i.e., did we spend the money in a proper way? Okay. Process reviews, uh, and then program element reviews. And again, we'll get a lot more details on these when we go through the longer workshop. But just be aware there's a responsibility for FHWA. And when they're thinking about what they're doing, they start with the law and then they work their way down to information. And the law is the top of the pyramid. Now, as I was looking, this is actually got from FHWA. There's actually a part of me that says maybe the law should be the foundation and everything builds on it. But I understand this hierarchy. It essentially says the law is the top. You have to meet the law, then a regulation under the law, and so on and so on. And actually, it usually means more paperwork. So maybe the order is correct after all. Now, in terms of New York State DOT, their roles and responsibilities, uh, from the local standpoint, that's the Local Projects Manual that they worked on. It used to have the acronym LPAF, and it's still that way on the website. They're going to help answer any questions on federal regulations. They're going to provide, again, technical assistance to the regional offices. And so the single most important person you need to be aware of for a local project has the lovely acronym of the RLPL, or the Regional Local Project Liaison. Okay? You really need to have good communication with that person. Pick up the phone, make sure you know who they are. There's a link in the handout to help you find who your RLPL is. If you don't know that person, make sure you do. They have to be involved. They actually do have to be involved. There's some places where they have to be involved in the construction process and actually even earlier on. But more importantly, even if they're not required to be on, pick up the phone and talk to them. They may be able to help you find resources that you weren't aware of. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, in terms of, you'll see the term sponsor. Sponsor is used in federal regulations for a lot of good reasons. What that really means from your standpoint, for those of you doing projects, is the local agency. Okay? So it's the local agency who's actually going to be the sponsor of a particular process or project. And there's certain roles and responsibilities that are involved. There will be a responsible local official. This is essentially the person who signs off and certifies things are being done properly at certain levels. Okay. That could be anybody from the mayor down to the highway superintendent, but that person essentially is the person who has the official ability to sign off on the project. You need a project manager. Now, this is something I want you to make sure of. Take one thing home from your own responsibilities. This would be it. The project manager has to be a full-time employee of the sponsor, which really means local agency. Okay? Has to be somebody working for the local government full-time. Now, could they be hired for a big project? Yeah, but they have to be a full-time employee during the project's phase. Okay? You're going to have an engineer in charge, a resident engineer. This could be a staff person or consultant, okay, who's actually making sure everything's being done according to plans and specs, okay? And then you're going to have inspector or inspectors, and there's whole charts on how many you need that are available, and we'll go through those in more details at the workshop. You're going to have a pre-construction meeting. There's actually several other meetings that you have to have, but I just want you to realize there is one, a pre-construction meeting, which the RLPL has to attend. Okay. But there are going to be other meetings as well. You need to make sure you've got qualified inspection staff, that they meet the responsibilities, that you're ensuring compliance with any federal regulations. You're dealing with change orders. We'll come back to that. And you're going to complete the closeout of the whole project. Okay. I.e., you're going to be managing pretty much everything through the RLPL with the state. And to do that, you need to have a construction management plan. Okay. Now, a lot more detail on this is available. This includes things like the standard specifications, the state's MERC, Manual of Uniform Record Keeping, procedures and policies that have to be followed, but you're going to develop your plan to put together your project, i.e., write it all down in a format that makes sense. There's some forms available to help make that a little easier, and meet with the RLPL to make sure the plan makes sense. It's going to have in it your project milestones. It's going to have your QA, QC, and your, again, probably going to be using something called the MERC, the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping. And we'll go through a lot more detail. I'll show you an example of that before we're done here in about 15 minutes. Now, QA, QC does not stand for, even though a lot of people think so, it does not stand for quit asking and quit checking. It stands for quality control and quality assurance. And this is actually something that Feds did on a presentation they gave, and I like it. It's a good way to think about it. Not the only way, but it's a good way to remind yourself. Quality control is the contractor, quality assurance is the agency. There's other people who define them slightly differently in terms of quality control being a numerical, quality assurance being a process-based. But whatever works for you, think about you do need to have different approvals. The contractor is going to do different things than the agency is going to do. But all of it together is the process of making sure that you're getting what you're paying for. The quality assurance program has to be part of that construction management plan, CMP. It includes your inspection, your sampling, your testing, and your certifications and documents. It's really important to have a good set of forms that you can follow, and we'll talk about forms here in just a minute. But just real quickly, okay, I want you to just think about, for asphalt paving, back on our pole EV, what are some of the quality assurance items that you check for when you're working with a paving contractor, and whether it's a federal aid or not? Just see what you guys put up there. 4 or 5 items that you think are important for QA, quality assurance. Density, okay. Temperature, inspection. What's the status at the plants? How good are the joints? How's the density? What's the temperature? Okay. Now realize some of these are actually quality control items done by the contractor. Some of them are quality assurance. They overlap, and it can get very difficult to separate them out at times. But it's important to understand who's doing what. Okay. But realize that if the contractor is doing something, you may need to do it as well as the sponsor or the local agency. They need to be independent of each other. You can't really have the contractor doing their own certification. You can have them provide data that you then check, but be careful that you don't blend those two together too much. Okay. Now, the job of the inspector, We're going to spend a lot more time with the job of the inspector later on, but just realize that think about this. The job of the inspector is to document the conditions that exist. What are the criterion that are being followed? What are the specs? And if there is an issue, what is the cause and what are the effects? Okay. Just document what you see if it needs to be documented. Okay. Seeing nothing and everything is okay is okay. You can write that down and you should. One of the things we always tell people is write down even the good news. Don't just write down the problems. If there was no problems, document that as well. Now, FHWA does its own inspections. They're slightly different. They're not the kind of inspection you're on the job and you're looking at the quality of the work. They're looking at inspections from a process standpoint. They're looking at initial inspections to look at, are you meeting the quality goals, DBE goals, things like that. They're going to do a final inspection in some projects that are of real interest to the division. Um, but just realize that those are developed as part of the overall management plan. So don't worry about them. I actually find these to not be that bad. I'm much more concerned with making sure I know which ones have to be done than the inspections themselves if you've got a good project. Now, progress payments are generally monthly. If you're wondering, you can ask for the money every month. Okay, the process actually goes through the state. The state gets the money from the feds and so on. And the reimbursement process can be on all kinds of things, but realize it's for the work that you've actually performed. Okay. Now, it may include your stockpiled materials. So it can include the fact that you've stockpiled your stone or you've stockpiled your steel. You can pay for that. Okay. But you can't get a final payment on something until you've put it in place. But it's for things you've actually spent money on. Okay. Usually the estimate is prepared by the EIC, engineer in charge, or the resident engineer. Okay. And again, this process is a lot more details, but keep in mind, how do you go back and check it later on? It's for what you've actually spent the money on. Now, we could spend a whole hour, and right now I've got, I think, about 20 minutes on change orders alone in the full workshop. But the key with change orders is they should be legitimate. We really don't want to have a situation, this is a picture you can find on the web, of a little boat that says original contract and the huge boat that says change orders. No, a good scope, a good design, you won't have that big of a change order. Change orders should be small. So what I want to do is give me some legitimate change order items, some things that really actually are honest. Yeah, okay, we can do this change order and nobody's going to be going, ooh, later on, versus don't put in the ones that you realize, we probably shouldn't have put them in there. What's a legitimate change order that should have been in the process? Flag persons exceed planned. Okay. You need more than you thought you needed. Yeah. If traffic was more. A subsurface issue you didn't catch. Somebody in the Q&A put utility conflicts. The quantities are slightly different. Yeah, that's a major one. Unexpected field conditions. Rock that wasn't anticipated is in the Q&A. Buried items. Do you notice a trend here? I'm not saying these aren't legitimate issues, but think about how many of these could have been caught in the scoping phase or in the design phase, where maybe we could have not had to have a change order, because we all know change orders cost us money. So we really want to try to catch these things earlier. It's why I like to build the whole project in my head. If there's a bird or an invasive species, really nice to know that ahead of time, okay? Because there's an issue. And weather delays, of course, you may not be able to do much. Yeah. So you can imagine change orders. We could go crazy. And poor scoping as the last one there is an issue. Yeah. So with project closeout, we're not going to do a lot on that one right now, but just realize it's the construction completion. This includes your final inspection and your contract closeout. There's a lot more details we could go with, but this is where I want to just remind you there are forms available in Chapter 15, in fact, throughout the entire Local Projects Manual. I love forms, but I hate paperwork. Anybody on here who knows me and paperwork knows I'm not a fan of it. But I actually do like forms um, if they're well designed. If they're not well designed, they actually can make your process even worse. Why are they useful? Well, they make sure we don't miss something. So again, on this sheet, you're all thinking the font is too small, I can't read it. I'm saying please don't try. The figure is on the web and it's included in your handout. It's a nice checklist of what you need for a project to close out. So before you finish the project, you need to fill that chart out. Okay? We're all used to that. And we've all had forms that were well designed and you're like, whew, that's what I need. I'm done. You've also had forms where you're like, why do I have to tell them how many times I've sneezed in the last 3 days? What? Huh? A good form helps, but think about that as you're even developing your own forms for your own self. Okay. Now, are we done with final acceptance? Even after we've got all that done? No. There may be some outstanding claims and disputed work. There may be unfinished items. Somebody had mentioned in one of our items the idea of the punch list still needs to be finished out. There may be other pending issues that come into play. Don't close that contract out until you've got all those things taken care of. Now, you may need to put in a reserve fund or hold some funds aside, but be careful. Once you've closed the contract out, your options change. Okay? You really want to make sure if there are any audits that have to be done, they're done before the contracts are all out of the way. That could create issues for people. Okay? And of course, the audits could be done by anybody. The state and the feds, when they provided us some of the information for this webinar, mentioned they can be done by the state or FHWA or technically any agency like EPA or uh, somebody like that. But the reality is you could do your own audit. It could be another group that wants to audit it. The idea behind the audit is it's clear, complete, and it provides some documentation. Most of us have probably been audited or at least threatened to be audited by the IRS. Always makes us nervous, but actually, truth be told, audit can be helpful um, if you think about it to make sure we did the right thing and better, and we're better for future projects. Now, there are some other issues. I'd love to have more time today to do this, but this is going to take us probably half a day just to go through some of these other issues. Okay, so one of the days we're going to be focused a lot on this issue. Okay. Somebody asked a good question. I'll go back real quick. I do have a couple of seconds here. Who's responsible for the audit? Well, if it's done by the state, it'd be the state. If it's FHWA, it's FHWA. The agency doing the audit would be the one responsible. You can do a self-audit. There are some techniques for that. Um, the idea behind an audit is to make sure you didn't miss something, that you've covered everything, that you didn't miss. Somebody didn't get paid. Heck, that's actually a real common issue. Somebody put some funds in the wrong account and the money didn't show up in your account. You can catch that with an internal audit and catch it earlier, maybe than an external audit might. Okay. But there's other issues. There's Buy American. There's issues of civil rights. There's DBE goals, commitments, and attainments. I do want to, before I move on this one, realize that if you're doing federal aid, DBE goals are different than the WMBE goals of the state process. They're not the same and they don't overlap. When you're doing that, you need to talk about something called commercial useful functions, prompt payment for your contractors and subcontractors, and of course the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which, by the way, you'll notice isn't in the list. Uh, Prevailing wages, EBO, we could do a whole laundry list. And they're actually outlined pretty well in Chapter 15, and we'll go through those in detail as we do the workshop. But you could also read through and look at those as well. Now, at the end of the day, Federal Highway is going to focus a lot on compliance enforcement. This is where they eventually could come up with something, one acronym I want to show you, I hope you never get to see. It's called FAIN, okay? A FAIN is a Federal Aid Ineligibility Notice. It's the last step that essentially says, look, we've tried to do what we can, but we're not going to pay any more money. You don't want to get a FAIN. I hope you never see one, okay? So keep that in mind, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some acronyms to finish up here, just the last couple of minutes. I just want to go through and pick a couple of acronyms out that hopefully you remember now. You can do them without looking it up, that's great, but I'm going to write them here on the screen. And in the Q&A pod, let's see if I do this. I'm not going to do feign since we just did that, but let me try one here. Let me make sure I get a good color too, because white will show it better than black. I think I have black. Yep. Okay, here we go. So let's do one. Here, let's do M-U-R-K. What does M-U-R-K stand for? Manual of Uniform Record Keeping. Yeah. Okay. And I'm not going to worry about minor changes. It's minor. Okay, cool. I like it. Good. That's essentially a record keeping document the state put together. And it's a very useful way to look at things. Okay. Let's do another one. PM. Project manager. Okay, very good. Okay. Now, if I take PM and add one more letter to it, what do you think that stands for? Project manager plan, project management plan. It's similar. It's the management plan that's used by the project manager. It's not a poor man's pizza, PMP. People went to Cornell would know what a PMP is, but that's a different project. Okay, I'm going to do one more, and let's see which one from the list do I want to do. This one is not an abbreviation. It's not an acronym, but it's still pretty important if my pen will write. Come on. What is a sponsor? Yeah, it's the local agency. Okay, it's the local agency. So when you see the word sponsor, that is you. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, again, I hope to see most of you for the workshop we're doing. It's going to be on 3 Tuesdays in the morning, 3 hours each day from 8:30 to noon with some breaks in between, no more than an hour at a time, just to mind can absorb what the can endure. Um, but if not, hopefully this helps you out and realize what you can and can't do with federal aid. And we'll also talk about some state aid as well during that process. If you have any questions or you need more information, you can send me an email directly to david.orr@cornell.edu or to our CLRP email address. Okay, or you can go into our website, nysltap.cals.cornell.edu, and find a lot of this information, including the handout from today. Okay, so I've taken up your hour. If you have a question or two, you're welcome to throw it in the Q&A. I'll stay on for a minute or two to do that. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Stay warm. It's winter has come back for a couple of days, and we'll go. Oh, and I learned something in our chat pod. It's National Women in Construction Week, so you can go and look that up if you're interested. Okay, and thank you very much. Everybody have yourself a great day.